Sonic the Hedgehog, a game that brought Sega to new heights and a true icon for the 16-bit generation. Like most success stories, it was the combined talents of the crew and key pieces falling into place at the right time that contributed to its glory. The first key piece of the puzzle was the rise of Sega's consumer division, a once modest group of programmers and designers that were tasked with porting Sega's arcade smash hits to their home systems. From the mid-80s, it became a true breeding pond for young talent inside the company. Among them were the aspiring cartoonist Naoto Oshima and the programmer Yuji Naka, who had a knack for creative problem-solving. The two had worked together on the ambitious title Phantasy Star. The lead game designer on this title was Kotaro Hayashida, who had directed Alex Kidd in Miracle World the year prior. Both 8-bit games became huge hits and marked the first big success for the console team. In 1988, Sega's new 16-bit machine, the Mega Drive, was ready to hit the Japanese store shelves. With the limited number of third-party developers that had signed on, it was up to Sega's console division to provide a satisfying library of games. They once again ported their latest arcade hits, along with releasing sequels to their own two hit series. With each project only given roughly 3 months development time, it was a true rollercoaster ride, and corners had to be cut. For instance, with Phantasy Star 2, there wasn't enough time to implement 3D dungeons. After this hectic period of producing the Mega Drive's lineup for 1989, there was more room for original titles. Kotaro Hayashida had risen through the ranks and become head of the department, and thus had a big hand in which projects to start. Hayashida was adamant that the Mega Drive needed a strong platform game like Super Mario Bros. Among its heavy arcade-oriented lineup. Thus, he saw potential in the game concept by designer Naoto Oshima for a platform game that would feature some fresh mechanics. Around the same time, programmer Yuji Naka had expressed his desire to work on a fast-paced game. Hayashida allowed the two to combine their talents and, with his input, rework Oshima's original concept. At the start of 1990, the distinct characteristics of their new, ambitious game were outlined. A platform game with uneven terrain, high-speed scrolling, and with its own strong identity. The project was greenlit and assigned an ample 10 months development time. Fleshing out all other aspects like the setting, story, and game design would prove to be an organic process that required its share of time and iterations. Hayashida appointed game designer Hirokazu Yasuhara to help out with managing and advancing the project. It wouldn't be long before the team would take their next major step, establishing the game's main star. He was shaped around the team's desire to have a simple yet effective control scheme, one in which players could perform all actions with a single button. A character that could curl up into a ball and so jump and attack with a single action seemed to be a perfect fit. From all candidates, they picked the spiky little mammal, the hedgehog. The fact that these creatures weren't native to Sega's two biggest markets, Japan and the US, would contribute to his fresh image, the team thought. At the same time, the character's appearance was to have instant appeal. When Oshima further developed his sketches, he incorporated elements from icons like Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat to provide that familiarity. Their new star and their ambitious project would become known as Sonic the Hedgehog. While the Sonic team still had a long road ahead of them, other Sega teams were finishing up their own titles and were backed up by the slowly growing third-party support. The president of Sega Japan, Hayao Nakayama, had set high goals for the Mega Drive. The once tiny US office was now becoming a well-organized unit to market their console and even produce games of their own. Sega's 16-bit machine was also about to be launched in the PAL market, where Sega had been blessed with strong support during the 8-bit era in various regions. On a global scale, Sega's market share was still modest compared to industry giant Nintendo, and with the Super Nintendo looming on the horizon, they were ready to steal all of Sega's thunder. Thanks to the booming success in the arcades, Sega could financially support their ambition in the console market. Management felt it was time for the company to have a suitable mascot character, and so a company-wide design contest was held. Nakayama considered the Western market of utmost importance, so their new mascot should therefore be designed with the Western audience in mind. Oshima was certain of the potential of their game and new star. Sonic had inherited Sega's brand color, blue, and the company values, cool, up for a challenge, and full of spirit. He was therefore not only a mascot, but a true embodiment of the company. Using his background in advertising, Oshima prepared an elaborate presentation with mock-up stationery, a toy model, and the speedy game in development. Over 200 characters were submitted in the competition, and Sonic made it to the final 8. With only 2 contenders left, head of marketing of Sega of America, Al Nilsson, was consulted to pick the winner. Having only a couple of faxed images to judge from, they both seemed quirky to Nilsson, but he chose Sonic as he seemed the lesser of the 2 evils. Once Nilsson visited the Japan offices shortly after, the initial skepticism quickly made way for excitement when he saw their new star zipping across the screen in an early prototype. The Sonic team members had started to flesh out the game's first level and think of ways to take advantage of the unique spin and roll abilities. When it comes to creativity, our mind works like a sponge. We constantly soak up images and music we're exposed to, and these all greatly influence our creative projects. Sonic's influences would be shaped by the late 80s. For instance, one of the inspirations behind Sonic's iconic red sneakers was the cover of Michael Jackson's Bad album and the shoes he wore in the music video for Speed Demon. Sonic's red shoes perfectly contrasted with his body, which made them stand out while running. When Oshima started drawing concept art for the various zones, he thought of incorporating the look of 3D computer-generated imagery. Computer graphics had really started to take off in the 80s. It was still a new and highly experimental art form, but big leaps were made in terms of technological advancements and tools. The film industry used it to portray futuristic or imaginary worlds, while the advertising industry embraced this technology to create impactful TV ads. Oshima's concept was to replicate a 3D look with 2D pixel art to give the impression that the Mega Drive was able to display polygonal graphics in real time. As the home consoles were built around 2D graphics, the polygonal art style would really stand out. The introduction stage Green Hill Zone also incorporated other aspects from early CGI, like its iconic checkered patterns. They proved to be a successful way of conveying depth. Similar to the work of Japanese illustrators like Eijin Suzuki, Green Hill Zone would have a vibrant look, as if it was filmed in bright direct sunlight with strong shadows. Artist Gina Ishiwatari had been tasked to turn the concept sketches for this unconventional zone into pixel art. She really showed her skill and dedication in bringing it to life, working long hours to realize its final, striking look, blending organically natural elements with a computer graphics look. Green Hill Zone had been the first stage put into production. Part of the challenge was to figure out a way to break the uneven terrain into small, repeatable blocks, which games of that era used as foundation. Green Hill Zone was just one of the many concept areas. Oshima's sketches ranged from a Gold World zone to a laboratory zone. His ideas would be further refined during development to form the final selection of stages, each having their own unique feel and making their own contributions to the variety of the gameplay. Polygonal artwork would continue to be a theme in their overall design. Ishiwatari would continue to work on the level art and was helped by Rieko Kodama, who was already a well-respected designer inside the console division. Together, they created the bulk of the pixel graphics. Oshima had started researching the principles of character animation, a subject he wasn't yet experienced in. He incorporated what he'd learned in the sketches of the various poses of the main characters. For the game's title screen, Oshima drew from a completely different source of inspiration. At that time, he had developed a fascination for illustrations on World War II flight jackets and aeroplanes. Yasuhara took notice of this, and together they wrote a first backstory in which Sonic and his adventures in the game were the fabrication of a fictional children's storybook author. She had based the character on her husband, a test pilot in the US Air Force who was the first to break through the sound barrier. His nickname was The Hedgehog, which was depicted on the back of his flight jacket. Meanwhile, programmer Yuji Naka had successfully coded a first full demo that allowed for mesmerizing scrolling speeds. To implement the uneven terrain, he was able to build upon the experience he gained from porting Ghouls and Ghosts to the Mega Drive. Capcom had given the programmer full support during this project and shared their original code of this arcade classic. In June of 1990, a year before the game's release, Sonic would make his first public appearance. An early prototype was demoed at the Tokyo Toy Show, although with little fanfare. Even in this rough form, the lightning-fast gameplay, parallax scrolling, and the cool character managed to spark interest within the gaming press. The time had come to further refine the character's look and backstory and guarantee his success with Western audiences. Initially, it led to some heated discussions, as both the development team and Sega of America were passionate about the spiky hero. It was decided to remove distracting elements, like a planned girlfriend named Madonna. Sonic already had enough of a cool factor that he didn't need others to leverage his appeal. At this point, the enemies for the game still went as far back as Oshima's concept for Twin Star, taking place in a dream world in which the hero had to vanquish nightmares. But this idea was about to be put on the shelf to make way for a completely different story. The 90s was a time when environmental impact was gaining more awareness, which would be reflected in the game's new storyline. Sonic was to stop the evil scientist, Dr. Robotnik, obsessed with technology that polluted the world. Robotnik was modeled after a mustached human character that had been in Oshima's mind from the start. The monsters from the dream world were replaced by badniks, evil contraptions that imprisoned Sonic's animal buddies. One of these poor creatures is Flicky, a blue bird from the classic Sega arcade game by the same name. With these elements in place, they found the simple but fitting narrative for Sonic's first adventure. Yuji Naka already had 2 years of experience developing for the Mega Drive and was well aware of its strengths. He started to tap into its maximum potential and utilized all the tricks and tweaks to introduce a richness and depth that was rarely seen on a console before. Typically, data inside the video memory, like position of characters, backgrounds, and color palettes, is only altered in between frames, so when the TV isn't currently drawing the image from top to bottom. However, altering some parameters while the image is still being drawn can create interesting effects and is a way to get past certain limitations. For example, by overriding the color palette mid-frame, the top half of the screen displays all graphics in a different color than the bottom half. This simple trick extended the number of colors on screen and was an efficient way to implement the underwater effect. Similarly, the parallax effect in Green Hill Zone was realized not by scrolling the entire viewpoint at the same speed, but altering it at specifically timed intervals. Horizontal rolls of pixels could scroll at different speeds, even though they're all part of the same background layer. Another trick to simulate more depth is to take advantage of the console's priority render system. Sections of a layer with a high priority flag were rendered first, and so essentially double the amount of layers. The Mega Drive video chip only supported 2 background layers and a layer for movable objects called sprites, but with some careful planning, these effects could produce a dynamic scrolling landscape that seemed to have at least 7 layers. It's important to add that these effects didn't require a lot of CPU power or data transfers, and therefore hardly impacted the overall speed of the game. However, it was in the special stages that Yuji Naka really showcased his skill. Before working on Sonic, he had already written a tech demo that could simulate a rotating layer using sprites. In contrast to background elements, sprites can move freely across the screen. His routine constantly altered the individual X and Y positions of sprites so that they all combined to form a moving maze. Rotations of blocks were simulated by pre-made animation frames. Depending on the angle of the maze, the game code would display a different animation frame. Naka's clever solution only required recalculating the position of a limited number of objects to simulate a 360-degree rotating screen. Coming up with creative solutions like this was one of his signatures. Sonic's uneven terrain and high speed had required a great deal of clever programming to keep him at the right angle and prevent him from running through floors and walls. For game designer Hirokazu Yasuhara, Sonic's speed would also affect the complexity of his work, not least because levels were easily 3 times the size of the ordinary platformer. Although Naka and Oshima contributed to the game design, it was Yasuhara's effort that further defined the game. Yasuhara's general way of working was to sketch out engaging gameplay situations that could be incorporated into the levels. The game is literally filled with these little moments that evoke emotions in the player. Understanding the human psyche and playing with concepts like fear and reward are the foundation of game design. However, there's no perfect formula for game design. Our tolerance levels and how various situations make us feel and how we act on them varies from person to person. Take Marble Zone and Labyrinth Zone, for example, the 2 slower-paced areas of the game. The platforming challenge, test of patience and fear of drowning may result in stress and frustration for some players, while others find the slower pace of the underwater ruins a welcome change. Music and visuals and the memories they evoke also greatly influence how we perceive a level. The game's signature game element, Sonic's speed, is another psychological element. In a way, players are tempted to go full speed and feel the thrill of zipping through the levels, but yet they subconsciously know that there may be danger lurking ahead, which they might not be able to avoid in time. The ring system was implemented to only punish players mildly when running into a badnik. The falling rings allowed them to quickly recover after a hit. The team pushed to spawn as many rings on screen as possible for a neat effect. In Sonic, the terrain is an important part of your playground. It can be a psychological enemy when you're abruptly halted by an obstacle that breaks your flow. But keeping Sonic's momentum, avoiding obstacles, and taking advantage of ramps and hills can feel so satisfying. This ultimately adds an extra dimension to the gameplay, which is not only focused on enemies, but also interacting successfully with the terrain itself. Spring Yard Zone, at that point known as Sparkling Zone, was to be the perfect demonstration to showcase Sonic's unique analog feel. Because it was so unconventional, designing this zone became one of the biggest challenges and had to be rebuilt from the ground up a few times during production. To make the whole experience complete, the game needed a score worthy of the project's ambition. The company director had strong connections to the record industry in Japan, which led them to the up-and-coming pop band Dreams Come True. The bassist, Masato Nakamura, took on the task to compose Sonic's score despite being inexperienced with writing music for video games. He would record his compositions on tape and send them over to Sega, taking into account the number of audio channels available. Two members of Sega's sound team, Hiroshi Kubota and Yukifumi Makino, were tasked with rearranging and programming them for the Mega Drive hardware. They could build upon the setup that Hiroshi Kubota used for Moonwalker. It had been among Sega's first in-house Mega Drive soundtracks to use audio samples for the percussion instead of replicating them with the FM synthesis. Using this method, the drums would be more pronounced and authentic. Yukifumi Makino did his best to arrange the songs and would do the final tweaking together with Nakamura. Makino had actually just been transferred to Sega's sound team and had expressed his desire to do the full soundtrack before Nakamura was hired. He would still make his contributions by composing the iconic jingles and the haunting drowning countdown. When 1991 rolled around, it had been a year since Oshima pitched his initial plan. The support for the character had grown inside the company. For instance, the arcade division added the mascot as a little Easter egg in the racing game Radmobile. Sega of America had hired two illustrators to draw promotional artwork, Greg Ray and Greg Martin, portraying Sonic according to their liking. The Japan office contracted Akira Watanabe to make an acrylic rendition of their new star. These iconic images were used extensively in all publicity around the game. The extensive development time had allowed the team to organically implement and tweak their unique gameplay along the way. Green Hill Zone, for instance, had been rebuilt from the ground up numerous times as the game evolved. But time flew by and the initial 10 months quickly passed. It was decided to extend production by 4 months, therefore greatly exceeding the development time of the average game. Hirokazu Yasuhara would continue to do project management like scheduling the artists and musicians and keeping track of deadlines alongside his game design duties. Green Hill Zone and Marble Zone were nearing their final form at this point, but the layouts of the remaining levels had yet to be done. Some key decisions were still to be made right up to the final moment, for example, the order and names of the zones. Mere days before the deadline, the team had to abandon an elaborate sound test that would feature a band and a breakdancing Sonic. Although the animation was already done, they ran out of time and memory to implement it. In a last-minute effort, they filled the sizable chunk of memory reserved for the animations with the Sega yell from their commercials. Sega! This change actually worked out for the best, as it would set the game directly apart from other games on the Mega Drive, making the player aware it was a standout title. While the final code was signed off, both Sega and Nintendo were readying themselves for one of the spotlight events for gaming that year, the Consumer Electronics Show. With all the planned announcements, it was sure to be an eventful edition. Nintendo was about to launch their new 16-bit machine in the Western market with a new edition of the top gaming mascot, Super Mario. During a big media presentation, press and retail were being bombarded with impressive feats of Nintendo's system. On top of that, their partnership with Philips was announced to produce a CD-ROM add-on. The overall consensus was that Nintendo would quickly establish dominance in the 16-bit video game market. Sega presented their new lineup for the Mega Drive's third year, including strong titles like Quackshot, Streets of Rage, and their own CD-ROM add-on. Their planned game adaptation of Fantasia also caught the attention of the general press. But Sonic was the biggest trump card against Nintendo. One of Al Nilsson's bold moves was to go head-to-head with Nintendo and show Sonic and Super Mario World side by side at their booth as a comparison. There was no better way to counter critical reporters than to show Sonic's fresh and vibrant art style, high level of parallax scrolling, and lightning-fast gameplay. Nintendo would still garner the most headlines, but the real battle for the consumers was yet to start. Sonic launched in the summer of 1991. Sega of America had been one of his strongest supporters and dedicated a substantial budget for an elaborate advertising campaign. Sonic quickly became the hottest title on the Western market. But to Sega, Sonic was more than just a game. With him, they finally had the mascot and marketability to reach the masses. The vision of the three main team members to make Sonic feel familiar yet distinct and have him inherit Sega's core values had worked. Sonic gave the company a face. In seeing the game, it was not hard for consumers to set Sega apart from their competitors. Sonic's cool and fresh image was the perfect counterpoint against Nintendo. Sega of America's new president, Tom Kalinske, pushed to make their hit game the pack-in title for the Mega Drive, which helped to push close to 2 million consoles in a single year, more than in all 3 previous years combined. Backed up by a wave of new, strong releases and the lower price point of its console, Sega rose against all odds and was well equipped to stand their ground against the launch of the Super Nintendo in the US. Over in Europe, Sega acquired Virgin Mastertronic, who had successfully distributed Sega products in the UK, France, Germany, and Spain throughout the years. The company was turned into Sega Europe and could greatly extend their marketing budget. Local distributors in other parts of Europe also ramped up advertising in 1991, leading to rapidly increasing market share. When Oshima had just started at Sega, he jokingly said he joined because he wanted to be Santa Claus, meaning his passion lay in making products that brought a smile to children's faces. With Sonic, he certainly succeeded, as the game captivated millions of players around the world. His initial game plans had grown and snowballed as more talent joined the project. With the extensive development time given to them, they could create a unique platform game and fitting mascot that was ready to conquer the world.